Predicting the decline of a marriage is challenging, especially after decades built on unwavering trust. Recently, my wife shocked me by confessing her love at first sight for another man, a revelation that shattered me. However, what truly stunned me was her comparison to a scene from The Godfather. You know the one, where Michael Corleone in Italy becomes spellbound by a woman, described by his Sicilian guards as struck by lightning in love. This wasn't just a movie parallel, it was her reality, though I didn't recognize it then. Unlike in our early days, this thunderbolt moment occurred with someone else 25 years into our marriage, marking the start of its unraveling. But I'm jumping ahead. I often do that when reflecting on my past and its unexpected turns. Perhaps I should begin with an introduction. I'm Alan Gregerson, though everyone knows me as Greg. At 50, I live in a small Midwestern city a couple of hours from Chicago, where I work as an accountant for a large national firm. The job can be routine, but the pay is good, and aside from the busy tax season, I maintain a regular 40-hour workweek without weekends. I was married until 2 years ago. My former spouse and I share a daughter named Morgan, who is 25 years old, married, has a child of her own, and resides in Denver. After 26 years of marriage, my ex and I became another divorce statistic despite the 25 years prior, which I had thought were wonderful. As I've mentioned, I first encountered Tracy during my sophomore year at Iowa State University in Ames. She too was a sophomore, having transferred to my dorm after her freshman year elsewhere. I noticed her slender, athletic figure basking in Iowa's intense August sunlight outside the dormitory as I walked in with some friends. "Guys, I have to go. I'm about to introduce myself to the future Mrs. Gregerson," I joked, only partially joking. My friends followed my gaze to Tracy. "Wow," one of them remarked. I heard the words, but I couldn't say which one had spoken. I was completely captivated by this blonde beauty reclining on a towel and a bikini beside the dorm. Leaving my friends behind, I approached her, but as I got within about 4 feet, she propped herself up on one elbow and waved me off with her other hand. I felt crushed until she spoke up. "Hey, idiot, you're blocking my Sunday." I swiftly shifted about a foot to my right, allowing the sun to cascade back onto the enchanting woman beside me. Her megawatt smile illuminated me, and in that moment, I would have gladly acquiesced to any request she made. "Much improved, you do," she chuckled. She didn't appear fazed by the presence of a stranger approaching her. I suppose when you possess her level of beauty, such encounters are commonplace. Introducing myself, I expressed admiration for her beauty and proposed a date for the upcoming Friday night. "If I agree, will you kindly remove the drool from your chin?" she teased coyly. "What?" "Oh, yes, the drool." "Absolutely, it's gone," I stammered like a clumsy fool. "Well, it's quite evident you're not one of those smooth talkers with rehearsed lines, so yes, let's go out on Friday night." I obtained her phone number. That Friday evening, we dined at a cozy Italian restaurant in Ames. While I sat there, enraptured, she regaled me with tales of her life from the age of 3 until the present. It seemed she paused her narrative only when the main course arrived. We just seemed to connect effortlessly, and within a month, we were spending almost all our free time together. Not only was she intelligent, having been her high school's valedictorian, but she possessed a mischievous sense of humor and a quiet self-assurance. I believed I had decent looks, not exceptional. I was reasonably athletic, earned 7 varsity letters in high school, and was intelligent, ranking in the top 5 in my class. I was capable of engaging in thoughtful conversations on various subjects. While Tracy pointed out that I wasn't the type with a smooth line for every occasion, I had confidence in myself. When I asked her out, I knew I was aiming beyond my league, but hey, you don't get anything if you don't try, right? Tracy and I had our first intimate contact on our 6th date. Neither of us had much experience, but at that point, I didn't have many partners, and I realized it was the same with Tracy. Despite my limited experience, I had a secret weapon. I actually read articles in various adult magazines, not just looking at the images. Judging by the enthusiastic reviews I received from my partners, I must have been very skilled at this, and the knowledge I gained through it was not in vain. Tracy and I tied the knot shortly after graduating. Securing jobs was a breeze for both of us. She landed a position as a third-grade teacher while I pursued a career in accounting. With stable incomes, we bought a house a couple of years later and welcomed our only child, a daughter, almost exactly a year after moving in. Life was satisfying. Our intimate life, while not overly adventurous, provided enough variety and frequency for both of us to be content. However, over time, as with many couples, the demands of time and age somewhat reduced the frequency. Even when Morgan left for college, we maintained a passionate bond, engaging intimately 3 or 4 times a week. Occasionally, I entertained worries about Tracy's fidelity, but these concerns were rare and fleeting. She might mention a new young teacher at her school being flirtatious, but she never gave any indication of reciprocating or taking things further. I chalked it up to my own insecurities. Granted, Tracy is undeniably attractive, and I couldn't fault anyone for admiring her, but admiration was as far as it should go. I made my stance clear to Tracy early in our relationship: there's no room for sharing. She echoed the sentiment, assuring me she felt the same. While she didn't mind if I glanced at other women, any physical contact would be unacceptable. I respected her boundaries wholeheartedly. That was our understanding until 3 years ago when we found ourselves at the annual summer party hosted by our neighbors 3 doors down in our fashionable neighborhood. Scott and Wendy Harris always throw a day-long bash at their place the weekend following the 4th of July. Tracy and I make it a point to attend every year, along with most of the neighbors on our block, and we always have a fantastic time. Scott and Wendy are exceptional hosts, providing great food and drinks, and their property boasts a sizable in-ground pool and a sand volleyball court. Even the guests they invite from outside the neighborhood are generally enjoyable, with just one exception, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The festivities kick off at noon, and Tracy and I strolled over around 1 o'clock. I headed to the bar, fetching a white Zinfandel for Tracy and a Michelob for myself, and we began mingling, initially sticking together before gradually branching out into separate conversations both indoors and outdoors. This had never been an issue before. Periodically, I would check in with Tracy to see if she needed a refill or a snack, or she would seek me out. Typically, we bid each other farewell with a quick peck on the lips. I was chatting with some male neighbors while Tracy was across the yard talking with a group of women when a few outsiders arrived. There was a man accompanied by 2 women, and Scott went over to greet them. That's when I noticed Tracy's sudden change in demeanor. While observing the newcomers, I happened to glance at Tracy. She had stopped conversing with her friends and was fixated on the newcomers with a look that seemed to blend astonishment and desire. At the time, I couldn't quite decipher her expression, but it was clear she was captivated, and I must admit I felt a sense of unease. After watching them for about 10 seconds, Tracy turned towards me, locked eyes, and blushed deeply before returning to her friends. Have you ever had that strange sensation that something isn't quite right but you can't pin it down? Realizing my presence, Tracy exclaimed, "Oh Greg, please," noticing my hold on the man's wrist. "Greg, meet Charles Delan. He teaches European literature at the college and joined last year. He's French." Charles didn't overstep any boundaries, so I didn't object to his hand placement. The others in the group nodded in agreement, prompting me to release Charles's wrist and offer a firm handshake, exerting some pressure to assert dominance. Tracy then introduced me to the rest of the group almost as an afterthought. "I thought you might need a refill," I remarked as I handed Tracy a glass of wine, fixing my gaze on Charles. "You're so thoughtful, my dear husband," she replied. "Charles, pronounced the French way as Charles, struck me as your typical Eurotype. I must admit, he was rather good-looking. Around 32 years old, standing about 6 foot tall, and weighing approximately 170 pounds, he sported a scruffy 3-day beard and had hair that seemed undecided between being long and needing a trim. His English carried a distinct French accent, leading me to speculate that he might be romantically involved with half of his students, regardless of gender. After the introductions, he resumed discussing Victor Hugo or someone similar. Feeling satisfied that I had made my presence known, I wandered back outside to the yard. Tracy and Charles eventually joined us in the backyard for the start of the sand volleyball game. I was always heavily involved in these matches, and as we played on the winner's court, my team saw plenty of action. A decent crowd usually gathered on the deck, observing from a safe distance, where my wife had settled with Charles by her side. I was too engrossed in the game to pay them much heed, but I did catch glimpses of them engaging in friendly gestures such as touching arms and hands, sharing smiles, and even witnessing an occasional blush from my wife. Every now and then, I'd wave over to her, and she'd wave back. After my team had secured multiple victories and continued to dominate the court for an hour, I realized that Tracy and Charles were no longer in their seats. Scanning the bar and grill area, I couldn't spot them either. Sensing something amiss, I convinced one of the other players to take my place, citing fatigue in my 47-year-old legs and a desperate need for a beer. As I departed, I endured good-natured teasing about my age. Maintaining the charade, I headed to the bar for another drink, then wandered aimlessly around the yard before eventually entering the house. I searched through every accessible room and strained to listen at the closed doors, but found no trace of Tracy or Charles. Eventually, I approached the hostess, Wendy, and casually inquired if she had seen my wife recently. "Sure, she and Charles went outside to check something in his car," Wendy replied nonchalantly. "Which car does he drive?" I asked, a hint of irritation creeping into my tone. At that moment, realization dawned on Wendy. With over 15 years of friendship and neighborly ties, she adopted a concerned expression and responded, "He drives a gray Saab." I stepped outside and glanced in both directions down the street. There was no sign of the Saab. Just then, Wendy joined me in the driveway. "I'm sure it's nothing, Greg," she said in a soothing tone. "They probably just went over to the college for a moment." "Yeah, thanks." "Probably nothing," I replied, lacking conviction, and then walked away. The local college was only 5 minutes from our house. I decided to check it out myself. I drove to the school and combed through every parking lot they had, no Saab. I tried calling Tracy's cell, but it went straight to voicemail, indicating she was either busy or her phone was off. I left a message, followed by 4 more over the next hour while I waited at home. I also reached out to her parents and her sister, asking if they had heard from her that day. They all said no. That's when the old Sherlock Holmes quote came to mind: "Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth." I settled into my lazy boy in the family room, fixating on the empty oversized screen for what felt like an eternity. There was no need to power up the television. The vivid images of my stunning wife being passionately involved with that Frenchman played relentlessly in my mind. Why did we bother rescuing that country in 2 world wars? We might as well have left it to the Germans. Sleep eluded me throughout the night as I remained glued to the chair, my gaze fixed on the silent TV. I half anticipated Tracy's return in the dead of night, but as the hours passed without her arrival, I entertained the unsettling thought that Charles might have been involved in a car accident with Tracy as his passenger. By 8 a.m., I couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. I dialed the local sheriff's office, identifying myself and inquiring about any accidents overnight. Disappointingly, they reported none. I made 4 more attempts to call Tracy's phone, but each time I received no response. As noon approached, I heard a car pull up in the driveway, indicated by the sound of a single door slamming shut. Approximately 45 seconds later, Tracy inserted her key into the lock, opened the door, and entered. A few moments later, she noticed me in the family room and silently seated herself on the sofa across the room. Any lingering doubts I had, my doubts about their activities, dispelled by her appearance. At least she had the decency to show up before returning home. Her long blonde hair, which had been loose yesterday, was now pulled back into a damp ponytail, and she wore no makeup. She was dressed in the same yellow sundress as the day before, and her chest, shoulders, and arms had a pinkish glow. She bore the satisfied expression of someone who had been thoroughly gratified, and I must admit, she looked stunning. There was no trace of remorse or guilt on her face. If anything, she seemed to wear a smug smirk. "Nice of you to show up. Did you have a good time last night and this morning?" I sneered. "Actually, I did," she replied smugly. That wasn't the response I anticipated. "Listen, Greg," she continued calmly, "have you ever experienced an incredible physical and emotional connection with someone from the moment you laid eyes on them? It's almost electrifying and wonderful and incredible." "Yes, I have," I responded promptly. "I married that woman." Her composed demeanor shattered, revealing a hint of recognition in her eyes, breaking through her calm facade. "I found mine yesterday. I can't explain it. I need him. I love him." "Just like that? Are you out of your mind?" I screamed. "You're willing to throw away 25 years of marriage over a feeling? Did I mean nothing to you?" I'm not sure why she didn't anticipate my outburst. She began sobbing uncontrollably when I exploded, but I remained indifferent. "I do love you, Greg," she finally managed to say through her tears. "Our time together has been wonderful, but the connection I have with him is just incredible. I love you, but I'm in love with him. It's incredible, incredible. I understand. Give me some time to adjust, and I'll throw you a celebration," I snapped at her. "So, should we start the divorce process, or do you want to?" I asked. "We'll split everything evenly, including selling the house." "I don't think we need to rush into divorce just yet," she replied, her voice tinged with exasperation. "Let's see how things unfold. We can make major decisions later." Now it was my turn to feel exasperated. "What?" I protested. "That's not how it works. You don't get to keep me as a backup plan. If you're with him, then go to him as soon as possible. As far as I'm concerned, we were finished when you slept with him yesterday. Repeating it only strengthens my decision." She stuttered. "Fine, I'll file for divorce and move out by the end of the week." True to my word, I moved my belongings out of the house by the end of the week. I took a couple of personal days off work to sort it out. While I was loading my pickup one evening, Scott and Wendy Harris approached me and apologized for inviting Charles to their party. I stopped them, politely reminding them they couldn't have predicted Tracy's actions. "Still, we feel somewhat responsible," Wendy said, avoiding eye contact. My attorney prepared the divorce papers, and Tracy was served within a month. It seems she assumed I would procrastinate, as my lawyer informed me that the process server mentioned she reacted strongly when he handed her the papers. This might explain why she appeared at my new apartment just 2 days later and forcefully entered when I answered the doorbell. "How could you initiate this if you truly love me as you claim?" she exclaimed as she entered my apartment. Initially shocked, I quickly regained composure as anger surged within me. "Are you sincerely oblivious?" I retorted angrily. "You're involved with another man. What did you anticipate my response to be? I might love you, but I won't willingly accept being made a cuckold. And if this doesn't work out, what am I supposed to do then? Just grant me some time. If things go awry, I'll return to you and be the perfect wife. We can grow old together. You're living in a fantasy, I countered sharply. I'm not granting you permission to pursue your ideal partner while you decide if it suits you. Furthermore, if he's truly your ideal partner, why would it not work out? Charles is currently going through a divorce with his wife, and they're dealing with some financial matters. Does that mean he could be Mr. Right for you, but you might not be his Mrs. Right? I inquired. She continued to stammer before I eventually demanded that she leave my apartment or I would forcibly remove her. Tracy and her lawyer attempted to delay the proceedings as much as possible. Meanwhile, Mr. Wonderful moved into my former house and assumed my position 4 months later as I exited Shamey Shells with a colleague following a business dinner. I spotted a familiar duo making their way to the door, Charles and a visibly pregnant Tracy. She appeared to be approximately 3 months pregnant. I halted in surprise, blocking their entry. "Oh my God," I whispered, my companion pausing beside me, clearly bewildered as the four of us stood face to face. "SJ, I'd like you to meet my wife, at least for a few more months, and her lover, Charles Deline." She found herself in the awkward position of needing to maintain politeness in a highly uncomfortable scenario. I thought he handled it admirably. He stammered. "She's pregnant." "Is that yours?" "That's definitely is," I responded cheerfully. "You're an ass, Greg, you know that," Tracy remarked curtly as she and Charles passed by us and entered the restaurant. Later, Wendy Harris informed me that Tracy was indeed 3 months pregnant. Evidently, Tracy had decided to stop using birth control because she thought highly of Charles and wanted to have his child. "Good luck with that," I remarked to Wendy. The divorce was finalized several months later, and 2 months after that, Tracy gave birth to a son. Naturally, they named him Charles Jr., perhaps as a testament to Charles's perceived greatness. Our daughter Morgan wasn't thrilled about Tracy's decision to have another child, especially given the circumstances of our separation and the fact that I wasn't the father. I was proud of Morgan for supporting me in this situation. Although I knew Tracy had the baby, I hadn't spoken to her or seen her since our encounter at the restaurant months prior. It was inevitable that our paths would cross again, given that we both lived in the same town. But I was taken aback the first time I saw her after the birth. The weight gain didn't suit her, and it seemed like the experience had taken a toll on her 49-year-old body. I almost didn't recognize the somewhat grandmotherly figure pushing a stroller with a toddler in it at the local mall. "Come on, Greg, there's no need to be so rude," a familiar voice called out as I hurried past them one Saturday afternoon. I abruptly halted my steps, unable to resist the urge, and took a slow, almost cinematic second look at the woman and the baby before me. Oh no, it was Tracy and her son. "Hey there, long time," I managed to say, trying to compose myself. "Hey to you too," she replied. The baby, predictably, was adorable. He inherited Tracy's hair and eye color but had his father's slightly darker complexion. "Wow, he's absolutely gorgeous," I remarked sincerely. Tracy blushed lightly and thanked me for the compliment. "It's been a while since we've crossed paths and, well, seeing you with a stroller," I apologized for not recognizing her immediately. Though she visibly flinched at my apology, she graciously brushed it off without comment. While I had found her incredibly attractive after Morgan's birth many years ago, she was now more than 2 decades older, and since this baby wasn't mine, I suppose my hormones were firmly under control. We exchanged friendly conversation for a few more minutes, mostly about her struggles with sleep deprivation, and I sensed a hint of genuine sadness, a sentiment she never exhibited after Morgan's birth. Eventually, I made my excuses and left to resume my shopping for the items I had originally set out to buy. The next encounter with Tracy occurred at the Harris's summer gathering about half a year later. Scott and Wendy had always felt remorseful that Tracy had met Charles at their party, but I reassured them then, and truly meant it, that I didn't hold them responsible for Tracy's regrettable choice. Nevertheless, Wendy persisted in trying to set me up with her single and divorced acquaintances, and I must admit some of those introductions were quite promising. Despite skipping the last 2 summer parties, they continued to extend invitations, and this time I decided to attend. Even though they cautioned me that Tracy and Charles would also be present, I assured them that if any issues arose, I wouldn't be the instigator. I intended to stick to that promise. I had been at the party for a couple of hours when I spotted Tracy and Charles entering the backyard. Since their baby wasn't with them, I assumed they had left the child with a babysitter. Tracy had shed some of her pregnancy weight and didn't appear as matronly as the last time I had seen her, but there was an unmistakable sadness in her once lively blue eyes. Even when she smiled, there was a vacancy in her gaze that I couldn't shake. I addressed the elephant in the room early on by approaching Tracy and Charles, offering her a brief hug and shaking his hand. I sensed a slight surprise from both of them, and I could see Wendy holding her breath as I approached. We exchanged small talk for about a minute before I excused myself and returned to my friends by the grill. As the sand volleyball game began, I joined one of the teams during the second game. While I was on the sand, I noticed Tracy sitting in a chair, watching and cheering. Mr. Wonderful was nowhere in sight. After playing 2 games and losing the second, we had to leave the court and wait for our next turn. While getting a beer, I glanced over at Tracy sitting alone. Old habits die hard, I thought to myself, grabbing my drink and heading indoors. Upon checking the third room, the den, my suspicions were confirmed. Charles had his arm around Marilyn Jansen's waist as he conversed with a small group, while Marilyn gazed at him with desire. Marilyn, a former neighbor from down the street, was unmistakably married. I should have kept it to myself, I thought. If this is what I suspect, then he plans to be intimate with this woman tonight by betraying Tracy. If I don't say anything, it will be my fault. If I speak out, it will cause chaos and I will still be wrong. A real friend would have informed her, but I wasn't a real friend. I was her ex-husband. Why should it be my duty? Then fate intervened. Marilyn's husband, Troy, who happened to be on my sand volleyball team, apparently followed me inside to discuss strategy. When he noticed the same scene as me, Charles hugging Troy's wife and she looking at Charles like he was irresistible, he shouted, "You are a despicable person. Get your hands off my wife, you idiot." He rushed towards them. I initially moved to intervene in the impending altercation, but then reason prevailed, and I allowed my volleyball teammate to pass me. Before Charles could break away from his wife, Troy seized Charles's arm, forcefully twisting it. There was a distinct crack followed by Charles's agonized cry. The commotion drew more onlookers into the room. Luckily, one of Wendy's friends, an ER nurse, quickly assessed Charles's injury and called for an ambulance. They arrived with 2 accompanying police officers about 10 minutes later. The officers took statements from everyone present in case Charles decided to press charges against Troy Jansen. The senior officer, Sergeant Jim Hill, appeared to be around my age, while the junior officer, Officer Kathleen McDonald, looked about 40 with unmistakably Irish features. I made a point of giving my statement to Officer McDonald. Amidst the chaos, Tracy was in tears, holding on to Charles's uninjured arm while trying to console him as the EMTs attended to him. It was evident she was unaware of the events leading to the altercation. Once Charles was stabilized, the EMTs transported him to the hospital, leaving Tracy behind. She looked at me for guidance, and I nodded, directing her to Officer McDonald before signaling 5 with my fingers. McDonald noticed Tracy waiting for me, so she proceeded to interrogate me. I recounted my version of events, mentioning that Charles had taken my wife from me at a party 3 years ago. Her reaction to this revelation was one of surprise. "Yet you're still planning to accompany her to the hospital?" she queried. "Are you simply exceedingly kind or utterly foolish?" I hadn't anticipated that question. Looking up at her, I noticed she was trying to suppress a smile. "Utterly foolish," I replied. "Can't you move on, Greg?" she whined. "It's been 3 years." "It's not about moving on, Trace," I replied. Charles shouldn't have laid hands on Marilyn Jansen, and Troy was justified in his actions. Maybe if I had shown such boldness, you and I would still be together. The words slipped out unexpectedly, bringing tears to Tracy's eyes as she turned away. In the pickup, I left Tracy at the emergency room and didn't accompany her inside. After our divorce, she and Charles had to share a small home with the proceeds we split from selling our house. With her occupied for the evening, I reached for the card Officer Kathleen McDonald had given me earlier from my shirt pocket. Quite a charming woman, I mused to myself. I decided to play it cool, so I waited 3 days before reaching out to Officer Kathleen McDonald. She picked up on the second ring. "Could you have waited any longer? I might have been engaged and married by now," she teased me over the phone. "Perhaps you're right, but rushing things won't make you the next and last Mrs. Alan Gregerson," I retorted. "Now who's being cheeky?" she shot back. "How do you know I'll even say yes when you ask me out? And no, I'm not interested in going to any Irish pub for a date." Her mention of an Irish pub caught me off guard because, truthfully, that's exactly where I had planned to take her. It just seemed fitting, taking an Irish girl to an Irish pub. She noticed my hesitation and correctly guessed my intention. "What's with you guys? Can't any of you be more creative? Just because I have flaming red hair, you all assume Irish pub," she said. I hesitated briefly before resorting to my backup plan. We had an excellent Greek restaurant in the city that I adored, and Greek cuisine was a departure from Irish fare. After a moment's thought, she responded positively. "Thanks for being spontaneous," she said. "When I pass on the Irish pub, most guys default to Asian, but I'm not a fan of food that resembles a haven for cockroaches." I burst into laughter at her remark, sensing a connection that could last a lifetime. We conversed for another hour, covering a range of topics. I learned that she was actually 45 years old, divorced for a decade due to her ex's infidelity. She had a son attending Michigan State University as a sophomore studying pre-law. Saturday night's dinner was exceptional, accompanied by wonderful company. I picked her up from her residence on the south side of town and was stunned by how stunning she looked in her little black dress and 4-inch heels. She had curves in all the right places, a lovely face, and vibrant red hair. She epitomized the term beautiful. We had one of those meandering conversations that seemed to touch on everything and yet nothing at all. Her voice was so captivating I could have listened to it all night. She didn't appear to be in a rush to settle down with a husband, much like I wasn't eager to hurry into finding a wife. This attitude made her both relaxed and intriguingly unpredictable, especially with her naturally curious nature. Almost like that of a detective, she posed some probing questions, showing that she was not only listening but also engaging deeply with what I was saying. After dinner, I drove her home. I didn't suggest going back to my place, and when we reached hers, she didn't extend an invitation either. We exchanged good nights at her doorstep, but then she surprised me by leaning in quickly and planting a soft kiss on my cheek. I must have turned 3 shades of red. I bid her good night and practically floated back to my car. I can't even recall the drive home, it felt like I was 16 all over again. Her lips felt so gentle on my cheek, and I'm almost certain she was wearing White Shoulders perfume. She called me Sunday morning, inviting me over for bagels and lox at her place. How could I refuse such an invitation? A few days later, Wendy and Scott extended an invitation for dinner, partly to offer apologies for recent events and partly to hear my side of the story. It turned out that Charles had been threatening legal action against them and Troy Jansen. "Doesn't this guy think he's the ultimate catch?" Scott exclaimed at one point. "He is quite handsome, dear, and undeniably charming," Wendy remarked, earning a sharp look from Scott. According to the Harises, Troy spent the remainder of the weekend behind bars before being bailed out on Monday morning. Upon returning home, Marilyn and their children were nowhere to be found. They had sought refuge with her mother in a neighboring town. Scott suggested that their 12-year marriage was likely at its end. Tell Troy to reach out to me and assure him that I empathize with his situation. I'm here if he needs a confidant, and I'll support him when this matter goes to court, I offered. We'll pass him a message and I'm sure he'll appreciate your support, Scott replied. By the way, we've decided that this will be the last of our summer gatherings. The stress is too much to bear. As Scott spoke, Wendy seemed preoccupied with her plate of peas. It was evident that things hadn't been the same in Harrisland since the party a few months ago when Wendy, 47, started showing a noticeable baby bump in public. My suspicions were confirmed. I didn't need to speculate on the identity of the father because Scott himself called me to disclose the news. Can you believe this mess? He practically yelled over the phone. That jerk got my wife pregnant. She's been having an affair with him since last year's party. Scott informed me that he remained oblivious until Wendy began experiencing morning sickness every other day. It mirrored the pattern she had during her pregnancies with their 2 children years ago. Upon realizing this, Scott confronted her, and she confessed to having an affair with Charles for over a year. However, she mostly insisted on using protection. They ran out during a weekend getaway to a motel where they decided to forego it a few times. Following this revelation, Scott jokingly asked for a referral to my attorney, quipping about a friends and family discount. According to Scott, Charles and Wendy had relocated to an apartment near the campus, leaving Tracy and her son to manage on their own. It's not my issue, I retorted. Little did I anticipate the complexities of the female psyche. While having lunch at a nearby McDonald's, she approached my table with her son in tow, their hands intertwined. Placing her lunch tray on the table across from me, the child eagerly took the seat beside me. Hi Tracy. Hi CJ, I greeted them. The toddler, now around 3 years old, extended a clean hand for a handshake. Impressed by his attempt at maturity, I accepted his hand and shook it firmly. Hello, sir, he said with earnestness. Hello, Greg, Tracy chimed in. He's growing so fast, I remarked to Tracy, glancing at her son. You might have a future 6-footer on your hands. From her expression, it was evident that Tracy acknowledged my attempt to be courteous, yet there was an underlying unease apparent on her face, suggesting that if she didn't address it soon, she might reach a breaking point. Come on, just ask, I gently urged her, observing her son unwrap a cheeseburger. Did you truly love me as much as you claimed? She began softly. Because if you did, why didn't you fight for me like Troy did for Marilyn? Why didn't you ask me to return like someone who genuinely loved me would? Why haven't you visited my house to check on me and my son, maybe even invite us over? I hadn't anticipated this. Was she implying it was my fault? I took a deep breath, trying to maintain composure and avoid an angry outburst. Whoa, I exhaled. So it's all on me? Really? You're the innocent victim here? As I spoke, my voice gradually rose in volume. This wasn't my intention. I needed, to convey my point. Whoa, I exclaimed, raising my hand. Remember when I removed Charles's hand from your waist, and you insisted there was nothing going on, asking me not to cause trouble? I trusted you completely and didn't pursue it further. Forgive me for putting so much faith in you. If I had known then what I know now, I wouldn't have trusted you. I would have reacted differently, like Troy did. But you, the person I trusted the most, lied to me, so I didn't fight for you. Then, when you returned home the next day at noon to noon, what could I say? The damage was already done, repeatedly by the looks of it. So what was there left to argue about? You had given yourself to another man and broken our vows. There was nothing left for me to fight for. You made it crystal clear this was your decision alone, and I had no say in it. So what remained to fight for? You were no longer mine, you belonged to him. But you never attempted to change my mind, she complained, or convince me to stay. Nothing. If you truly loved me, I asked, how many times did you sleep with Charles that first night and morning? I'm sure it was more than once. I remarked, the first time could have been a mistake, and maybe I could have forgiven you. Choosing to do it again was a conscious decision. Anything beyond that was you breaking my heart and shattering it into pieces. And you had the audacity to claim you had a fantastic time, an extraordinary time if I recall correctly, and that you and he shared this almost supernatural connection. You didn't regret a single thing. You know lust and lost share the same four letters, so what was I supposed to think? As the saying goes, if you love something, let it go. If it comes back, it was yours. If not, it never was. And then, just to add insult to injury, you have his child at 48. I couldn't persuade you to have a second child in 25 years, but not only do you readily welcome Mr. Wonderful, you let him impregnate you. Is this all about your wounded male ego? She retorted, perhaps a tad too sharply for my liking. My attention snapped to that remark, but with the child present at the table, I resisted taking the bait. No, what you chose to do once you were with him was your decision. It seems you loved him enough to want to have his child, even if you never desired another with me. Believe me, I received the message. We lapsed into silence for a few moments. She seemed hesitant. I sensed the direction this conversation was heading, but someone had to broach the topic. So, what's your plan now? I eventually inquired. You and Charles never married, but he's acknowledged as the child's father, correct? At the very least, you should pursue him for child support. I'm going to let Wendy handle him, Tracy replied, but you're right, I should seek child support from that cheating jerk. That's sound advice. Do you ever contemplate what could have been between us? She added. How things might have turned out? To be honest, no, I replied softly. You shattered my heart so completely that I never wanted to dwell on what might have been. I cherish some wonderful memories from our past life that I'll hold dear forever, but that's in the past, and it's never returning. We resumed our meal. I observed the boy playing with his French fries, triggering memories of our daughter Morgan doing the same thing. He's a fine child. I'm relieved something positive emerged from that relationship. Despite starting with a remarkable connection, ultimately we never quite bonded as deeply as you and I did. While our physical intimacy began passionately, it didn't evolve alongside our emotional connection. Love never supplanted the lust once it waned. It was then that she seemed to realize it, that moment of clarity. She shook her head sadly, tears welling in her eyes. She had traded the warmth and security of love for the fleeting excitement of lust. Like a true lightning bolt, it had its fleeting brilliance before vanishing. Recently, my cherished partner and I celebrated a decade of marriage with an unexpected journey to Spain. Initially, I proposed visiting her homeland, as tradition would dictate. However, her playful reaction, marked by a gentle tap on my arm, steered us towards a destination offering warmer climates and spicier cuisines. The vibrancy and thrill of our relationship perfectly echo our choice of locale. As we continue working a few more years before retiring from the cybersecurity firm we founded together, we reflect on our shared successes. I transitioned from engineering, and she left her career in law enforcement to join me in entrepreneurship. Despite spending nearly all our time together, both personally and professionally, our bond remains as fresh and stimulating as ever. It may sound cliché, but my love for her only deepens with each passing day. With 2 children of our own, we now delight in 5 grandchildren. Despite the distance separating us, one family in Denver, Colorado, and the other in Houston, Texas, we cherish every opportunity to spend time with our beloved grandchildren. Occasionally, I run into Tracy around town, though our interactions rarely extend beyond a brief exchange. She is absorbed in the responsibilities of raising CJ, who is now around 13 years old. According to my daughter, who sporadically converses with her, Tracy has not remarried and rarely goes on dates. It seems her ex-husband, Mr. Wonderful, needed some nudging to consistently provide child support after initially resisting. It strikes me as a somewhat sober existence, lacking many luxuries. Nevertheless, we each navigate our own paths and must accept the consequences of our choices. I certainly harbor no regrets about moving forward with my own life.